The city of Sheffield in England was famous for its huge steel output. Nearly 40% of world steel was once produced there. Railways, bridges and ships around the world were built with it, and even the famous Brooklyn Bridge in New York has Sheffield steel in it. Stainless steel with its thousands of uses was developed in the city, and Made in Sheffield was the world's first famous trademark. But despite its industrial fame, the early history of the city is virtually non-existent. There must have been a presence in Anglo-Saxon times because the name Sheffield comes from the Old English word Shafeld, meaning border clearing, lying, as you can see, between the kingdoms of Mercia and Northumbria. Just a couple of brief mentions of Sheffield in the 11th century Domesday Book, and a few tax records, and that's pretty much it for the town's early written history. As far as Sheffield's medieval buildings are concerned, these were largely swept away as the Georgians and Victorians rushed to industrialise in the 18th and 19th centuries. So we haven't got much to go on. One slim seam of research might be to study the ancient castle of Sheffield, which would be a lot easier if it hadn't been demolished in the Civil War by order of Parliament in 1647, when possibly many of Sheffield's early written records were lost also. But two things we do know. The Sheffield Castle was one of the largest castles in the kingdom, and that some of the people who owned it were among the most powerful and wealthy people in England at that time. So let's try a reasonable working hypothesis, that the medieval fortunes of the town depended to an extent on the fortunes of the castle, and those in turn depended on the wealth and power of its owners. The famous ancient castle had an earlier incarnation as a timber motte and bailey castle, built by one of the early Anglo-Norman barons, William de Lovato, in the early 1100s. The lands of Sheffield and Hallamshire then passed on to the Furnivals family through marriage, and Thomas de Furnivall obtained a charter from King Henry III in 1270 to build a stone castle which was to stand for nearly 400 years. Adjoining the castle was a 2,000-acre deer park with ponds for fishing and fowling. Thomas didn't live long to enjoy his work, however. He died and was buried in his castle in 1279. The next Lord Furnivall, also Thomas, probably did more for Sheffield than any other early landowner. The people were freed from many of their feudal ties, and Sheffield became a free borough with a municipal court and trial by jury. In 1296, King Edward I granted Sheffield a weekly market and an annual 3-day fair. The area West Bar gets its name from the toll bar where people from outside Sheffield were charged to come to the weekly market. So who began Sheffield's early iron, tool and cutlery manufacture? The Romans? Well, they had an insatiable demand for iron, and several Roman roads ran within the current city boundary, but that's all we know. Anglo-Saxons and Vikings, well, both needed iron tools and weapons, but still no real evidence. But by the 13th century, cutlery manufacture was well underway. The Made in Sheffield trademark we mentioned earlier was first used by someone called Robert the Cutler, so the trademark still used today predates other world-famous brands by nearly 600 years. By the 14th century, Sheffield was well known for iron tool and cutlery production. Even Geoffrey Chaucer at the Royal Court in London mentioned in one of his Canterbury Tales of around 1385 a Sheffield thwittle, or sharp all-purpose knife, worn at the belt by just about everyone. But what effect did the Black Death of 1348 to 1352 have on Sheffield? Inevitably, there are very few records. Some things we do know are that between 30 and 40% of the population of England must have died, and many, many thousands of people migrated looking for work. The 300-year-old feudal system was damaged beyond repair. Landowners were desperate for workers and began paying wages, and those wages rose through lack of skilled labour. Cheap, unused land was available for profitable meat production, reducing demand for crops. And as a result, overall productivity increased and real wealth per person shot up. How did all this affect Sheffield? Well, the death rates from the plagues must have been similar, but the subsequent rise in wages for over 50 years must have had a significant effect on the prosperity of a town, providing tools, knives and cutlery for all those who can now afford them. Sheffield may also have provided weapons for the local lords involved in the 100 Years' War between England and France. In the early years of the 15th century, Sheffield Castle passed through marriage to John Talbot, the first Earl of Shrewsbury, and one of the most famous military leaders of his generation, even being mentioned in Shakespeare's Henry VI, Part 1. At his death at the Battle of Châtillon, France, in 1453, his bodyguard of Sheffield men perished with him. It was said every family in the town, rich or poor, was in mourning. The population of England kept falling, and so too demand. Workers were thrown off the land as landowners began renting out land to richer peasants, or turning it into pasture for livestock, and this began the 15th century boom in wool production. For Sheffield in the 15th century, the first 50 years of wars in France, which demanded more taxes and the lives of local men, were followed by 30 years of the Wars of the Roses, which took the second and third Earls of Shrewsbury and more men with them. A 40-year economic slump in the middle of the century completed the miserable picture. But the fourth Earl, George Talbot, did have a positive effect on the town and was Lord of Sheffield for 70 years. In 1516 he built the magnificent Tudor Manor Lodge in the deer park adjoining the castle, conveniently situated out of sight of an increasingly industrial working town with its smoke and smells. This lodge became the favourite residence of the Talbot family. Anticipating Henry VIII's dissolution of the family priory and workshop, the Earl also had a special chapel and burial vault built in the parish church of St. Peter and St. Paul for himself and his family, which you can still see today in the cathedral. The fifth Earl, Francis Talbot, was a trusted servant to four monarchs of greatly differing religious views, a pretty impressive feat considering the fates of many of his contemporaries. Most of his time was spent at court, but his funeral in 1560 was probably the most spectacular event in Sheffield's history. 79 deer were boiled, roasted and baked for the guest mourners at the funeral feast at the castle. Even the poor were invited to eat and drink, but only the leftovers. And they also got 2p each. That's about £3 or $5 today, so grief obviously got the better of generosity. The sixth Earl, George Talbot, had the dubious honour of being selected by Queen Elizabeth to imprison her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, for 12 years before her execution in 1587. Sheffield Castle was chosen because of its size and its defences. Mary arrived with 40 staff, mainly French and Scots, and Talbot added up to 70 extra townspeople as guards and servants to ensure she didn't escape. Elizabeth had reason to be paranoid. Mary had a good claim to the English throne and had vowed to return England to Catholicism. She also had support from the French court and some of the most powerful families in England, who wanted to return to the old religion and were prepared to back an uprising. What the people of Sheffield thought about their royal prisoner and the political comings and goings of the English and French royal courtiers in the town, we don't know. The idea they might end up in the middle of a religious war couldn't have thrilled them much, and an earthquake in 1575 which shook the town and castle walls probably didn't improve their superstitious humours either. But catering for the needs of the castle's many new famous and wealthy occupants must have meant plenty of work and trade to take the edge off their worries. By the end of the century, with Mary gone and George Talbot's death in 1590, Sheffield seems to have slipped into bad times. You can see more about that and the end of the castle in the third video. In the next video we'll look at the 1378 Sheffield poll tax rolls, and quite often this sort of stuff can put a glass eye to sleep, but in Sheffield's case it does throw up some fascinating insights into its medieval life. In the meantime, thanks for watching.